Hey there, welcome to another episode of Adventures in Local Marketing. I'm your host, Christian Bannister, Director of Product and Marketing at BrightLocal. We like to think of ourselves as rational people, right? Our decisions are based on logic and facts. But the truth is that we're all guided by internal biases that influence the way we think and act. There's a field of academic research called consumer psychology, which is all about the way these internal biases influence how we consider and buy products and services. Its usage across marketing is vast because, after all, marketing is all about influencing people's behaviour, whether that's encouraging someone to buy a product or to simply open an email. In this episode, I'm joined by Phill Agnew, who's host of marketing science podcast Nudge, and he's going to guide us through the 7 consumer psychology principles that every marketer should know. This episode's packed with real-world and lab examples of how consumer psychology can influence people's behaviour. You'll learn how a simple tactic makes people 82% more likely to complete a loyalty card, and how a 73-year-old marketing campaign has changed the way we buy engagement rings forever. I promise this is going to be one of the most insightful episodes we've had to date, so let's jump in right now. Hi Phill, thanks for joining me today. Why don't you kick us off by telling us a bit about yourself and also tell us a bit about consumer psychology. What exactly is it?
Cheers, Christian. Thanks so much for having me on the show. So my name's Phill Agnew. I'm a senior product marketer at Hotjar, which is a company that does website analytics. And I also host Nudge, which is a podcast dedicated to consumer psychology. It's got over 150,000 downloads and 155-star reviews. And yeah, I really fell in love with consumer psychology about 4 years ago after reading Richard Shotton's brilliant book, The Choice Factory, and Robert Cialdini's Influence, 2 absolutely fantastic books that I think every marketer should read. And the reason I sort of fell in love with consumer psychology is at that point in my marketing career, I was really struggling to find repeatable tactics and strategies that really worked in convincing consumers to do things, convincing consumers to attend my webinar, to read my email, or to buy my product, whatever it might be. And I stumbled across sort of the realm of behavior science, consumer psychology, nudge theory. It goes by lots of names, but all of them sort of mean the same thing. By reading those 2 books, and they started to give me a bit of a framework upon which you can understand how consumers make decisions. So Richard Shotton's whole point is that we have spent hundreds of years trying to figure out how the brain works, hundreds of years figuring out how we react to stimuli and how we make the decisions we make. And as marketers, we should do as much as we can to learn that science because we are in the decision-making business. We are trying to convince people to make decisions themselves. So that's how I sort of fell in love with consumer psychology. And that's what it's all about, basically applying an understanding of the biases and the ways that our brains make decisions and using those to improve our marketing. Which is why I started Nudge podcast about 2.5 years ago. And on Nudge, I interview some of the experts around behavior psychology and then also some sort of pioneers and leaders within marketing who are applying this stuff. I get them to talk about the nudges or the behavior science principles that they love and adore. And we sort of discuss them on the show. And I'd love, Christian, to talk through a few of those nudges and biases with you today.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm really excited about learning more about them. I, like you, am absolutely fascinated by this topic. I think, as a marketer, it can often feel like there's so many tactics that you could be employing. I guess what makes consumer psychology potentially kind of have a bit more weight to it is that it's a scientific approach, right? These are based on research and studies that have been done. So is that the case for kind of all of consumer psychology? Is that what makes it what it is?
Yeah, I believe so. I think you would struggle to find a reputable source within the industry who isn't basing their findings based on studies. But the one thing that's important to note, and this is something that Rory Sutherland, who's head of behaviour science at Ogilvy, talks about, he says that in academia and in science, you have to be right. You can't be wrong. You can't be wrong when making a vaccine for COVID. You have to be right. But in business, you just have to be less wrong than your competitors. And that makes applying behavior science to marketing a really interesting endeavor, because you don't have to be foolproof in your application of the science. You don't have to get everything bang on, spot on, 100% perfect. You just have to do a slightly better job than your competitors. And what I've found since applying these principles is that really the playing field is relatively easy to fight and win on, because there aren't too many companies, too many competitors that are really trying to apply the science behind consumer psychology to their marketing. And that means that it's quite easy to find ways to dramatically improve your messaging and content with some of these studies. So just to go back to your original question, yeah, most of them are based on actual findings, studies in the lab. But since then, marketers have sort of gone off on their own whim, started to test out these things themselves, and have found ways that they can be improved on, and ways that they work for specific industries and products.
Okay, so that's really the important part, right? Yes, it is based on lab research, but ultimately it needs to work in the real world. It needs to work for the average marketer who's trying to improve their messaging or running marketing campaigns. And I know that on some of your recent episodes of Nudge, you've been doing just that, right? You've been trying out some of these principles on your own podcast, and there was a few others. So I'd be really keen to learn, what sorts of experiments you've run, and were there any interesting findings along the way?
Yeah, so the last sort of 4 episodes of Nudge, I've been experimenting with nudges and seeing if I can increase the listenership for my show by applying some of these principles, eating my own dog food, as our American friends would say. Let's start with a very sort of simple nudge that most people would know, which is social proof. So social proof is the idea that you are likely to follow the actions of others. If you're walking down a high street and you see a dozen or so people looking into a shop window, you probably can't help but look into that window and see what they're looking at as well. You follow the actions of others. There are lots of studies which showcase social proof. Probably my favorite comes from Richard Shotton in his book The Choice Factory that I referenced earlier. He went into a London pub back in, I think, 2017 or 2018, and he asked the barman, "What's your best selling beer?" And the barman said I think it was London Pride or one of the ales. And Richard said, "Brilliant. So there's this nudge called social proof where people follow the actions of others. What I would like to do with this ale is put a sign next to it which says, 'This is our best selling beer this week.'" He wanted to see if actually telling people that there was a really popular beer at the bar would increase the number of purchases. So he put that sign up. They had it running for a week, and they compared week-on-week sales, and they found that sales for that beer increased by 2.5 times. So a dramatic increase in the number of people buying that beer. And what's really interesting as well is the total sales for the bar didn't stay the same. They all rose. So people weren't just switching their behavior and buying that beer instead of other beers. They were actually buying more beers in general, and more likely to buy, say, 1 or 2 pints of that London Pride beer. And so I wanted to take this finding and actually use it in my show. So I decided to do some very basic tests, some tests that email marketers would laugh at me for even calling it a test. I tested the subject line of a few emails that I sent out. So I also run a course called the Science of Marketing course, and I wanted to get everybody who's on that course onto my newsletter. So I sent them an email saying, these are people who hadn't already subscribed. So I sent them basically an email that would say something along the lines of, "Please sign up for my newsletter if you haven't already." And I tested 2 email headers in the variant. One which said, "Sign up for the Nudge newsletter and get a weekly dose of marketing insights." So just really talking about the benefits. And then another email header which said, "Sign up for the Nudge newsletter. Most marketing of science students like you sign up." Now that was using social proof because it's suggesting that people follow those actions. Now what's interesting, and this is a lesson to learn here, I ran that test and the social proof version actually performed worse. So it actually performed worse. I had more unsubscribes and less people signing up after sending that email. And I think a lot of it was down to the fact that people didn't identify as these students who are on this course, they might have taken the course 6 months ago, 7 months ago, and they were saying, well, most students sign up for this newsletter. I'm not a student. Why should I sign up for it? So it didn't actually work. And it's a good lesson because you need to test your nudges. I did then run another test though, slightly later on. And this test was to encourage people to listen to one of my latest shows. And on the email header, I tried the control, which said new nudge, and then it listed the name of the show. And then on the variant, I had a bit of social proof. So we had just hit 100,000 downloads. So I put in brackets after the sort of email header, which was on the control, I put in brackets, plus we've just hit 100,000 downloads. So a little social proof, which suggests that people are enjoying the show. And lo and behold, that version did work really well. So that dramatically increased the number of people who listened to the show. I can't remember, but I think by 20% versus the control. So 2 lessons there. One is that testing social proof can have incredible results. So 2.5 times increase in the number of beers sold at a London pub and a 20% increase in the number of people who listen to my podcast. But you have to test it. You have to run experiments and make sure it works because, as I found out the hard way, it doesn't always work as you might expect.
Well, that's really fascinating to hear that, it doesn't always work and that you have to be testing. I can imagine social proof should be somewhat familiar to most people who are working in marketing. But I guess there's also this thing of social proof is a testimonial on your website or some logos of clients that you work with. But what I'm getting is that it's more than that, right? Those are kind of the base level pieces of social proof that you might include. So are there any other kind of studies that can show just how powerful social proof can be?
Yeah, it's such a good point, Christian. And I was guilty of that as well. In my head, social proof was nothing more than a little carousel underneath your main header on the website, which showed all of the big brands that worked with you. And almost always it's like Google's in there, Facebook's in there, these ginormous brands. But social proof is much more than that. And actually, probably one of the best ways to explain how powerful social proof can be is to explain a concept called negative social proof, which is actually the opposite of social proof. But it's something that Robert Cialdini discovered and referenced in this book, Influence. And he was walking around this very famous national park in Arizona. And in that park, there are basically these bits of wood called petrified wood. And this is fossilized wood that is crystallized and it turns into this beautiful sort of ornament, basically. And it's a very precious thing in Arizona. And it's very important that that petrified wood never leaves the park. Right? But unfortunately, lots of people would steal this petrified wood. They would take it home with them. And Robert Cialdini was pretty certain this was due to negative social proof. And negative social proof is the idea that if you tell people that lots of people are doing something, if you show them that lots of people are taking an action, they will take that action, whether it's good or bad. So the signs in the Arizona National Park said that, I think it was something like 7 tons of petrified wood is stolen each year from this park. Please don't steal the wood. But Robert Cialdini's point was, no, what you're doing here is you're making it seem commonplace to steal the wood. You're making it seem like everybody steals wood because 7 tons is stolen each year. This wood's quite light, so that's a lot. And so he was suggesting that this is negative social proof. Social proof is actually encouraging more people to steal than they would otherwise. So he got in touch with the park rangers and ran a test. He put up 2 different signs in 2 different parts of the park. One, the control, had the original sign. It said, 7 tons of petrified wood is being stolen each year. Please don't steal the wood. The other sign, which he had in another part of the park, used a different message, a sort of a control message, which said something like, please don't steal the wood. It's not good for the park. So no social proof in that one. And he found that when the sign said that 7 tons of petrified wood was being stolen each year, people were far more likely to steal the wood. Far more likely. I don't think I've got the exact stats here. It's again, influenced by Robert Cialdini, but it was something like 2 times more likely to actually steal the wood when you saw this sign, which suggested that other people did it. And I think this is fascinating for marketers. One, because it's obviously showing a sort of bias that we have within our brains towards following the actions of others. So finding ways to tweak your messages to say that most customers do this, most people upsell when they get to your side, most people in your industry tend to pick this package. All of these sorts of terms are very, very powerful in convincing us. But it's also vital that we understand the negative side as well. Because if you go onto wikipedia.com, you'll see them asking for a donation. But the way they ask for the donation is really dumb when you consider negative social proof. Because they say something along the lines of, if everybody gave $1, we would never need to ask for donations again. Essentially saying, if people could be bothered to donate to us, just $1, we would be financially stable. But that's negative social proof. It's suggesting that nobody donates. And I'm pretty certain, I haven't run this study, but I'm pretty certain they would be much better off if they just said that most people who read as many articles as you tend to donate $1 to wikipedia.com. I reckon that would be much, much better at convincing people. So social proof is far, far, far more than just logos on a carousel on your website. It is a really powerful bias that dictates so many of the decisions we make, especially when information is scarce. So especially when we're not sure how likely people are to steal petrified wood from a forest or how much people give to Wikipedia. So being aware of social proof and trying to use it in your marketing is a really important thing for any marketer, I'd say.
Now, I want to try and cover as many of these principles as possible within the time that we really have. So what would you say is the next one that is really important for marketers to know about?
Yeah, it's a tough one because, there are so many. I think there's over 100 recognized biases that we all have.
Okay, wow.
So there's a lot to cover. But one that I really like is the endowment effect. That's mainly because I work in SaaS marketing. So a big part of my role as a product marketer is to encourage users to sign up to our free trial, to sign up to our product basically online. And it's really important to do that because if they sign up to the free trial, they're then more likely to end up paying and so on and so forth. Product-led growth, essentially. So product managers listening will know exactly sort of what I'm talking about here. And there's a vital sort of bias that we need to be aware of when trying to convince people to sign up for your product, and that's the endowment effect. So the endowment effect is the idea that you're more likely to complete a task that has already begun. So if you are getting towards the end of your workday and you're on your to-do list, you've got write difficult email to my boss about some sort of subject, you will struggle more to write that email if you haven't written the first word. You'll be more likely to shut your laptop and say, I'll just do that tomorrow. But if you have written even just hi boss at the start of the email, you'll be more likely to complete that task because the task's already begun. We have this tendency to want to finish things. That's the endowment effect. And it was discovered back in 2006, or I should say popularized back in 2006 with an incredible study around loyalty cards given out by coffee shops. So in this study, the researchers gave out loyalty cards to people who bought their first coffee at a coffee shop. They gave out two types of loyalty cards, the control and a variant. The control was a normal loyalty card that you all recognize. It had 9 sort of stamps that you needed to collect, and you got a stamp every time you bought a coffee. And then once you'd got all 9 stamps, you would get a free coffee. A classic loyalty card. The second loyalty card had 11 stamps that you needed to collect, so 2 more than the control. However, when the barista handed you that loyalty card, they would stamp in the first 2 stamps for you, so basically giving you 2 stamps for free. Now the idea here is that the second loyalty card and the first loyalty card are technically identical. You still need to go and buy 9 cups of coffee before you get a free cup of coffee with either sets of loyalty cards. But the endowment effect kicks in and it actually changes our behavior. So when the task has already begun, when the barista has given you 2 stamps to get you started on your journey to getting a free cup of coffee, you are 82% more likely to complete that loyalty card, 82% more likely to come back and continue buying coffees with this coffee store. And this is really important for especially I think all marketers, but especially SaaS marketers to know. Because when you're trying to convince people to sign up to your product, you should be doing as much as possible to make it feel like they're making progress in their task. You should be doing as much as possible to make it feel like they've already started. So doing things like capturing their email and name and then putting that in the free version of your product, like at the top of the app, for example, is really important. Showing the amount of completion rate that they've done on their onboarding process, you're 25% of the way through, is really important. Showing how many steps are left in the sign-up flow. All of these things, there's so many better examples of how you can apply this nudge. But showing that the task has already begun and getting people off quickly is a really, really valuable nudge, which I definitely think everyone should know about.
Nice one. Yeah, I can imagine this can be applied to lots of different industries, because obviously there's loads of different industries that offer loyalty cards. So many of our listeners might be working with local businesses or run local businesses themselves. So they're already handing out those loyalty cards. Is there anything else at play there? I guess one of the principles that I know about is reciprocity. That's always a hard one to say. So does that kind of come into play as well, with the sense that customers are being given something? So I guess maybe if you could explain a bit about that, what that principle is to begin with, and whether that's actually something that could also be influencing people to complete their loyalty cards.
Absolutely. So reciprocity is one of Robert Cialdini's 7 principles of influence, which he talks about in his book. And reciprocity, everybody knows this. You don't need me to explain what reciprocity is. It's essentially just, you are more likely to return a favor to somebody who's done you a favor earlier. And a great study which first highlighted this was by Dennis Reagan back in the 70s. And in his study, he got a participant, so somebody off the street, to come into an art gallery. And it was basically asking them to review the pieces of art in the gallery. That's what he asked them to do, but that actually wasn't the study, because during the study, the participant was joined by a fellow participant, or at least that's what they thought. This was actually a sort of a fake participant put in there by the researcher, Dennis Reagan, because the real test happened around their interactions and the reciprocity that they gave. So the participant who was brought in from the street was looking at the artwork, and then in 50% of the cases, the sort of fake participant goes out, buys 2 cans of Coke, comes back and says to the other participant, "Hey, I had a bit of extra change. I bought an extra can of Coke. Would you like it?" Basically does the person the favor. That happened in half of the scenarios. In the other half of the scenarios, that participant just goes and buys a can of Coke for themselves. So you've got 2 variants here. One where there's a bit of reciprocity, one where there isn't. Later on in the experiment, the fake participant, so to speak, asks the real participant for a favor. He or she is selling tickets to a charity gig, I think, and he's basically asking them to buy as many tickets, or maybe it was a raffle, buy as many raffle tickets for a charity event as possible. The finding, lo and behold, you'll all know this, is that when you show a bit of reciprocity, the one in the example where he had bought his other participant a can of Coke to begin with, people were far more likely to buy more raffle tickets. I think it's in the 2 to 3 times more in terms of their spend. It's since been proven in other studies, again cited by Cialdini, around giving tips at a restaurant. So if you leave a mint with the bill, you're, I think, 2 times more likely to increase the size of your tip as well. So little acts of reciprocity can go a long way, and there's no doubt that that's having an effect with this coffee card example as well. But I also think another a nudge which is playing here, which is again linked, is the power of free. So it's this example, that it's this idea that we are heavily influenced by free things. We go out of our way to try and get sort of free items. And there's a brilliant study by Dan Ariely which highlights this, which I won't go into because it's a long one, but I will give one example of how powerful the power of free can be. Amazon Prime, let's say 10 years ago, launched across Europe. So Prime was originally only in the States, and then they launched across Europe. And Prime is a success story that we all know about, right? It makes people more likely to buy, it increases Amazon's revenue, yada, yada, yada. It worked in every single country they launched in Europe, except one. There was one country where it didn't work at all, and it was France. and they couldn't figure out why Prime wasn't working. Prime is this great product. It was working in every other region, but wasn't working in France. And they realized the reason it wasn't working is because France was the only location where delivery wasn't free. Delivery in France was 1 cent. So essentially free, right? Like 1 cent for delivery. It's nothing. It should have no impact. But the power of free really persuades us, and we're far more likely to act if something was free compared to if it's 1 cent. And it wasn't until Amazon Prime actually made the delivery free in France and didn't charge 1 cent. It wasn't until they did that Amazon Prime in France actually started to take off. So that's the power of free as well. So there's a couple of nudges at play there. There's the Endowment Effect, there's reciprocity, and the power of free too. All things that are worth considering when you're coming up with your next marketing campaign.
Nice. It's great to know that even Amazon haven't got it all figured out and they actually had to learn from their own data there. So we've kind of covered around 4, actually. We've managed to whiz through a few different ones. What would you say is another interesting one that people should know about?
So I think anchoring is a vital nudge. Anchoring is the idea that when information is scarce, which is often the case when you're targeting people who haven't purchased a product like yours before, you will be heavily influenced by the first bit of information that you see. So an example of this, which is really shocking, comes again from Dan Ariely and his book Predictably Irrational. Dan Ariely is a consumer psychologist, but he's also a lecturer at a university in the States. And what he asked his students to do, say 150 students sitting in the crowd, he asked them to get out their social security card. Everybody carries them on them, I think, in the States, or at least they did in this example. Maybe he asked them to bring them in because they all got out this card. And he said, look at the last digit on that card. And they all looked. And he said, if your digit is between 1 to 4, go and sit on the left-hand side of the room. If your digit is between 5 to 9, go sit on the right-hand side of the room. So basically, split his audience into 2 groups based on this purely random number. There is no meaning behind the final digit of your social security card number. He then brought out a number of lovely different products to the front of the stage, and he said, I'm going to ask you to bid on each of these products. He said, now I want you to think about whether you would bid higher or lower than the number that was on your social security card. But I don't want that to actually change what you bid. I want you to bid independently, but definitely do think about whether you would bid higher or lower than that number. So he was trying to implant a little anchor. He was trying to see if this random number would change how much they would bid, if people who were primed by a higher number would end up bidding more, and if people primed by a lower number would end up bidding less. And so in the study, he brought out things like champagne, a mouse, keyboard, all these things. And he found that people who had the lower digits, so digits in the low, like sort of 20%, so 1, 2, and 3, when compared to people who had the highest digits, so 7, 8, 9 on their social security card, the people who had the higher digits bid almost 3 times more for each of these items than people with the lower digits.
Wow.
Simply because the anchor that they had been given was a low number versus a high number. So that's a really, I think, incredible finding. And what I think is so impressive about anchoring is it can be applied to lots of different things, including sort of marketing messaging and slogans. And one of the best examples of this comes from De Beers, who is the jewelry manufacturer. They create sort of engagement rings. And when De Beers has been around for ages, but back in the 1930s, they were trying to encourage people to buy diamond wedding rings. Nobody bought diamond wedding rings at the time, just 10%. I should say engagement rings. Just 10% of engagement rings at that time that were purchased were diamond, which wasn't great for De Beers, who were diamond jewelers essentially. So they wanted more people to buy diamond wedding rings. The problem is, diamonds are really expensive, and they were even more expensive back then. So they needed to create a marketing campaign that would encourage people to spend a lot of money on an engagement ring. And so they made a campaign which is now legendary. I'm sure most of your listeners, Christian, will have heard about this campaign. And it said, how can you make 2 months' salary last forever? And then it just has a picture of a wedding ring. And it says the diamond engagement ring. So it's a smart campaign because it's all creating an anchor. people don't tend to know how much they should spend on their engagement ring. Information is scarce. So De Beers give them an anchor. They say, what did you make in the last 2 months? That's probably what you should spend. It's something that will last a lifetime, something that will last forever. And it dramatically increased the amount that people would spend on their engagement rings, and meant that people were far more likely to buy a diamond engagement ring. And as I said, back in the 1930s, it was around 10% or less. And now, at least in the States, well, actually, this is from the study, it was looking back in the 1990s, 80% of people buy diamond engagement rings now, and a lot of that is to do with De Beers and their smart marketing slogan. And then sort of the final example I'll give, which shows the power of anchoring, is from Steve Jobs, who loved nudges. If you look at all of Apple's marketing principles, you'll notice lots of these things ending up in there. But he also loved an anchor, and he would use anchoring all the time to try and encourage people to think that Apple is creating a really good deal or a great product. And he's an infamous example of this comes from the iPad launch back in 2010, I believe. And when the iPad launched, information was really scarce. People had no idea what the iPad was. Was it a phone? Was it a computer? Should it be priced at the same price as a phone? Should it be priced as the same price as a computer? People had no idea. And journalists were debating this a lot before the launch. Most journalists were saying, this should not cost a lot of money. This has not got a use. It's not a phone. It's not a computer. This should cost no more than $299. That's what most journalists were saying. But some journalists were saying, well, if it's got a lot of good technology and if it's got a really powerful screen, it could cost $1,000. It could cost that much. But that was only a really small minority. But Steve Jobs, when he read those articles about it potentially costing $1,000, said, brilliant. This is the anchor that I can use in my presentation. So in his keynote speech, where he's just introduced the iPad, he then says, I need to get onto the topic of price. How much should we charge for this thing? And on screen behind him, he presses the button, and a dollar sign comes up with $999 next to it. He said, now this is the price that some of you thought the iPad should cost. You were mentioning how much power and technology is within this product, how incredible and innovative it is, how we've combined the best of the mobile and the laptop into one. And I'm not surprised that you think this is the price. So $999. And he's setting that anchor. And then he presses the next button. And literally, if you watch the presentation, it's quite funny. The $999 price is smashed by the real price of $499, which appears behind it. And he says, we've got all that great technology and we're only charging you $499. And the crowd literally whoop and cheer when they hear this. They're like, oh, that's that's such a good deal. But what's hilarious is that crowd is the exact same journalists who just days earlier was saying the thing should cost no more than $299. So the price has increased by $200, but they're now whooping and cheering. And that's all because of a smart use of anchoring. If Steve Jobs had just said it will cost $499, people wouldn't have been whooping and cheering. But by framing it and using the anchor of $1,000, of $999, he managed to get people on side and think that actually $499 is a really good deal for an iPad. So anchoring is definitely one of my favorites, and it's definitely one to think about when you're crafting your marketing messages.
Wow, that's a little scary, I think, just how much we can be influenced by something like anchoring. And I guess the first one, it feels completely irrational, a decision being made by just kind of a random number that you've been assigned. I guess the second one, I'd imagine that, most people are kind of familiar with the concept of, engagement ring costing 2 months' salary. It's almost like deeply ingrained into our lexicon, which is I guess shows the power of marketing and how that can obviously have a lasting impact over time. As marketers, do we need to think about how we're being responsible with some of these? I guess it was a question I was going to ask you towards the end, but this felt like a kind of a good jumping off point for it, because obviously, are we leaning on people's irrational biases when we employ some of these? And then do we have a responsibility to be using these, in a way that's moral?
Yeah, 100% yes. That's the answer. I think Neriel's got some great examples of how you should apply this stuff rationally and responsibly. His book Hooked is very useful for that, if you want to check that out. But the Spark Notes is essentially ask yourself whether you would want to be influenced by this behavior, if it would be useful for you, and then ask yourself whether you'd want your family and friends to be influenced by this slogan, this bias on this campaign, and then ask yourself if it's generally doing good or if it's doing harm.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to go about it. And I kind of see examples that are a bit of turn off for me. And I probably come from a position where I know more about some of these consumer psychology principles, but things like if you're promoting a webinar and then you pretend that there's kind of a limited number of spots available and you're effectively, creating, false scarcity. You're saying like, oh, there's only 15 spots left, but most webinar kind of hosting platforms don't really have those sorts of limits. So you're kind of creating this artificial nudge that isn't actually kind of true. And, me, myself, I can kind of see through it. But I guess the thing that, I usually do to check myself is, how would I feel if I was having these tactics used against me? And if generally, if I feel like, yeah, I don't really like that, I will avoid doing it myself.
Yeah, I feel it's interesting. That example is an interesting one because there's two ways of looking at it. There's one way, which is the marketer just plain out lying? Do they have unlimited seats on their webinar platform and they're just literally lying about how many seats are left? And if, let's say they say 10 seats are left and then 10 people sign up and then they say, now, 10 seats are still left, sign up. That is wrong. That's immoral. Yeah. That's lying. But placing a 50-person limit on your webinar because you want to increase the quality of the discussion, because you want to make sure that the people there are, definitely going to engage and give them more time to ask the questions that they want, that is actually really smart. So I think that's what I would try and suggest here. Applying principles like scarcity to an example like a webinar can be really effective and they are proven to work. But don't do it in an immoral, sort of almost lying way just to increase the number of signups. Actually embrace it and make it part of your service and make it part of your offering to improve the value that the actual participant or end consumer gets.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's the way to come at it. It's just like, is this actually true? Are we offering this for a good reason rather than just trying to make it feel like there's all of a sudden been a huge rush for people to kind of sign up for this webinar, or that there's an artificial limit that doesn't actually exist. So scarcity, I'd imagine that's probably one that people are familiar with, but is there anything else within that that's particularly interesting within this kind of idea of consumer psychology?
Yeah, there's something about scarcity which always surprises me, which has got nothing to do with marketing, which I'll tell you about quickly, Christian, which is that we feel scarcity just as humans within our life. So we really value scarce resources. We put an undue weight on things that are scarce, and this applies not only to products, but it applies to ourselves and how we reflect on our age. And so when we turn 29, 39, 49, 59, because it's the end of a decade, we start to feel kind of very influenced by the fact that we are losing the previous decade that we're in. So, at 29, you start to think, oh my God, I've only got 6 months worth of being a 20-year-old left, or 39. I've only got 1 month of being a 39-year-old left. And that dramatically changes our behavior in noticeable ways. So this is referenced in Dan Pink's book, When. He cites a number of studies around this topic, which essentially show that our behavior changes dramatically when we get to a 9 ending age. And it's all due to scarcity. So you are more likely to sign up for a marathon when you turn 29, 39, 49, 59. Sign-ups are much higher. You're also more likely, so that's collected by data from, first-time marathon runners across 6 of the major marathons across the world. They also collected data from Ashley Madison, which is like a site where you can essentially have an affair. And they found that people who had 9 ending ages were far more likely to sign up to that service as well. So people are more likely to do that too. You're more likely to make a number of big decisions around changing your job or changing where you live. And unfortunately, as well, shown from census data, you're also far more likely to commit suicide when you reach a 9 ending year as well. So scarcity, we talk about it in this example of there's 10 seats left on our webinar sign up, it's a very basic application of this bias, because this bias dramatically changes some of the major life decisions that we make in all sorts of ways that we probably weren't aware of. So as a marketer, it's 100% something you should study and learn more about, because it can have incredible effects. And I'll leave just with one marketing example, so you're not just left with that sort of weird non-marketing example. And it's just, for me, a fascinating one. So KFC Australia, a couple of years back, this is in Richard Chataway's book, Behaviour Business. A couple of years back, they introduced an offer. The offer was chips for $1. So fries for $1 if you're in the UK, but in Australia they call it chips for $1. It's a good deal for chips, and they wanted to publicize this offer across all their social media channels to encourage people to go and buy chips for $1. Now, KFC are owned by Yum Yum brands. They spend over 1.5 billion on marketing each year. They hire very talented copywriters, very talented marketers who are extraordinarily creative and brilliant at coming up with very good campaigns. And so they challenged all of their copywriters to come up with the very best marketing message they could think of to promote this new offering. So they came up with 90 in total. And there's some brilliant slogans. So I talk about this in one of my recent podcasts. So do go back and listen to that if you want to hear all the slogans. But, it's stuff like the Colonel's never been so generous, and from Perth to Brisbane, they're loved, only $1. They tested all these different slogans. They essentially created this giant split test on Facebook to see which slogan would basically perform best, which would encourage most people to go and click and actually purchase these chips. And what they found shocked me as well, because out of all this incredible creativity and storytelling and smart marketing, the slogan that was most successful, the slogan that encouraged most people to go and buy chips for $1 was this. It said, chips for $1, limited to 4 per customer. And that was it. That was the most successful slogan. So all of that creativity is great, but actually nothing competed with a little bit of scarcity. So a good example of how powerful that nudge can be.
Yeah, some really, really interesting examples, and one obviously that kind of like should hopefully empower a lot of our listeners to go out and start employing some of these principles, because you said that a lot of this stuff has potentially been around for, decades, maybe even 100 years, and obviously it's been applied to marketing along the way. But I guess today, we have tools available to us that marketers wouldn't have even been able to dream of, say, like 30 or 40 years ago. So like the ability to run A/B tests at scale on Facebook for like different advertising slogans wouldn't have been possible, I guess, for a marketer who was relying on TV ads or relying on print. So if that doesn't kind of convince you that you need to not only understand more about these principles, but actually go out there and start testing, then I don't know what it is, There's been a boatload of stuff we've covered, but there is one I wanted to cover with you, because I think it's a really fascinating one, because it kind of goes against what most people think marketing should do. So I'm referring to the pratfall effect, and I'm going to let you kind of explain a bit more about it, because I probably do a rubbish job compared to you.
Yeah, so the pratfall effect is a very interesting bias. It's the idea that we actually prefer imperfections, and highlighting your flaws can often be better than constantly talking about your strengths. So there's a great study from Jo Sylvester from, I think, Swansea University, and she basically set up lots of job interviews with fake candidates, but the interviewers didn't know that. And in the job interviews, the candidates would share identical sets of experience, identical sets of skills, always talking about the same things. The candidates would be identical in every single way, except one difference. The one variant was that Jo asked some of the candidates to declare a weakness, to declare a flaw, to say that they are bad at something. She wanted to see if that would have any effect on how likely these people were to get the job. And lo and behold, when you declare a weakness, when you say you're bad at something, you're far more likely to get a job than when you talk only about your positives. And there's something innately which makes sense, right? We like people. People who are a bit more vulnerable and share weaknesses are just a bit more likable, right? But we don't ever really apply this to marketing. We intensely talk about our positives, our benefits. KFC is finger licking good. McDonald's is loving it. Gillette is the best a man can get. We're always talking about positives, but highlighting negatives can actually have quite a positive effect. So there's a great example from Adam Ferrier, who's again a consumer psychologist. He's been on the show, and he showed cookies to participants, and the cookies were identical, except one had a very straight, rounded edge, so sort of looked a bit perfect, and the other had a very rough and ready edge, so it was not as rounded as the other one. And he found that 66% of people preferred the rough edge, so they preferred that little bit of imperfection in their products. So it's not just people within jobs, but it's also products as well. And there are some companies that actually employ this marketing within their this type of marketing within their slogans. So obviously Marmite is very well known for this type of slogan. They say you either love it or you hate it. And in 2015, they introduced a campaign which was called End Marmite Neglect. They were literally going out and telling people that Marmite was a disused product, that people neglect it. It sits at the back of their cupboard. All things that textbook marketing would tell you not to do. But the pratfall effect kicks in, and it makes this type of campaign more memorable and more sort of believable too. And that year, when Marmite and Unilever introduced that campaign, I think they got an additional 34 million in sales. Brand awareness went up something like 24%, and they won the Brand of the Year award at Adweek, all from the result of a campaign which told people that basically their product was being neglected. So you can get real value out of highlighting your flaws and declaring your weaknesses, and it's definitely something that's worth trying.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating because everyone feels like they need to present the best version of themselves. I guess when you're marketing your product or your services, I guess is this something that should feel scary to kind of marketers, right? Kind of highlight things that maybe aren't great for certain consumers. Is there a line that needs to be balanced with this? And I guess if you got any examples of how a marketer might go and employ this.
I think in terms of the line, testing is always important. I think you have to test to make sure that things will work for you. And that's actually what I did with my podcast. So in a recent episode, which you can go back and listen to if you like, on the pratfall effect, I decided to run a test myself because I wanted to see if this nudge really worked. I actually wasn't very convinced. Surely telling people not to do something won't encourage them to do it. So I put out a Reddit ad for my show, and the Reddit ad had there was two types of ads which I ran head to head, put the same amount of spend behind them. One ad said 5 reasons why you shouldn't listen to Nudge, and listed all of those reasons, and the other ad said 5 reasons why you shouldn't listen to Nudge, and listed all of those reasons. Now, the reasons why you shouldn't listen to Nudge were a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It was stuff like episodes are packed with examples, so you might get a headache, and you'll realise how useless your marketing degree was. It was tongue-in-cheek. It was a bit of a joke, but still, the advert said, "Do not listen to this show." So I was pretty convinced that people wouldn't listen to it, right? When I put those two side by side, put them head to head, I found that the click-through rate on the pratfall one, where I was telling people not to listen to my show, was 391% higher. It was massively, massively more successful. It's actually one of the best campaigns I've ever run for the show, and it's a variant of that campaign is the campaign I keep live sort of all the time to get new listeners. And yeah, that shocked me. I couldn't believe it. So I would definitely encourage people to try it. And when you try it, you sort of realize why it works, because we're so bored of seeing endless positivity in marketing. It's actually quite glib and superficial, Buy this thing because it's the best. Buy this thing because it's fantastic. Here are all our product benefits. Actually doing something a bit different and being like, we're not perfect. Here's why. But if you're still interested, try it out. Is really compelling. It's really distinct. It's more likely to increase recall, and I think more likely to encourage consumers to act.
Yeah, I guess a good example of that one would be Avis, the car rental company, who are obviously going up against Hertz, who are kind of the main player, had the biggest market share, and they marketed back in the 60s, calling out the fact that they were number two with the slogan, "We try harder." So I guess it's acknowledging, maybe some of what might be perceived as flaws, but then turning those into a strength.
Absolutely. And actually, back in the 60s, more companies did this. Listerine ran a campaign which says it tastes lousy, but that's why it works so well. Buckley's cough medicine in the US, I think it's Buckley's. They ran another thing similar, which said, the taste is awful, but that's because it's so powerful. And since then, 60s, people were a bit more creative. I think they didn't follow the textbook as much, which is why we saw a few more of these types of ads back then. But examples today are few and far between. The best one, which I came across, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners have as well, is this tiny ski resort called Snowbird Ski Resort. And they ran just a very simple magazine advert, something which usually doesn't garner much attention. But because it utilized the pratfall effect, it actually ended up going viral and getting a lot of coverage. And basically the ad was a picture of their ski slope, and a picture of someone falling over. And next to that picture had a real review of their ski resort. And it said 1 star, too advanced. And it goes on to say, "I hated this ski resort. The slopes are too difficult. They're too advanced for me. I couldn't ski on any of them. Really wouldn't come back here again." They ran that as a campaign, basically to say, like, here's our flaw, here's our negative, but for some people, you might like this, you might like that we're too advanced for most. And that campaign, which again was just a magazine spread, shouldn't have been gone viral at all, ended up being written about on Medium by one of their fans, and then ended up being shared extensively on social. And today that image has been shared over 5,000 times, or is published in at least 5,000 different articles according to Google. So it's huge ROI on something which had a tiny spend just from the utilization of a little nudge.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about this is this kind of two learnings from it. The first is that it has to be something that is appealing, right, to a certain type of customer. So you couldn't just say all of our customers think our support stinks, because that appeals to no one. But if you can take something that is unappealing to a certain type of customer, but super appealing to another type of customer, that's where this can have a really powerful effect. And I guess the other thing that I'm taking from this is, because these principles are not so widely used, it can actually really help you stand out. So like this ski resort probably had no right to go viral with any marketing campaign that they're running, but all of a sudden they hit on this thing that was so different from, say, how most companies might be marketing themselves, that effectively went viral and got their name out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're bang on. Applying these types of principles can be a very powerful way for people with tiny budgets to get big exposure. And I'll give you one more example before I leave, which is Helsinki Tourism Board. Their original slogan was that Helsinki was the daughter of the Baltic. And unsurprisingly, that didn't really get many eyeballs and wasn't shared very widely. And so they changed it. And they just put this banner up when you entered Helsinki Town Square, which said something along the lines of, and I do encourage you to go and get the actual quote, but it said something along the lines of, like, you have to be crazy. Nobody in their right mind would come to Helsinki in November, obviously implying that it's extremely cold and dark. And then underneath in subtitle it said, "Except you badass." And that's another great example. That was shared very widely, again, very popular, and a really great example of, this basically no cost, really, just putting up a banner in your town square. But that was shared so widely on social media, and I think probably made people think twice about going to somewhere like Helsinki in November. Made them think, oh, cool, yeah, I want to be a badass. I wouldn't mind seeing what it's like in the Baltic cold. Maybe I should book a trip, and probably encouraged action far more than saying daughter of the Baltic, which wouldn't really get anybody interested about going to Helsinki.
No, definitely not. Brilliant, Phill. This has been really, really enlightening and inspiring. So I'm sure that you said there was like nearly 100 of these. We've managed to cover a fair few, so I've done a good job on that front. But where can people learn more about these consumer psychology principles? What's a good place to kind of start if they're dipping their toe in on this podcast for the first time?
Yeah, well, obviously, I would encourage them to listen to the show. Most of all, I would tell them to read first. I love this stuff, but I'm not the expert within the space. Definitely go out and read Influenced by Robert Cialdini if you haven't already. That's a must read for every marketer. And if you're still interested in the subject after that, then do feel free to check out Nudge. There are episodes every 2 weeks, 20 minutes long, no fluff, no bullshit, get straight to the point with really high value content. If you want to listen to that, it's available on all of the sites where you listen to your podcasts, or you can go to nudgepodcast.com as well. And then I also run a course called the Science of Marketing course, which walks through over 52 lessons and 6 hours of video content, some of the principles that I think are vital for marketers to know to help them gain awareness, to help encourage consumers to actually make a decision and purchase their product, all the way through the marketing funnel, talking about the nudges that are best for each stage of that funnel. So if you are very interested, you can check that out as well. But definitely read those books, and do try and check out Nudge wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Nice one, Phill. We'll drop some links in the show notes to all of those. Thank you so much for coming on. It's a topic that I'm really interested in already, and I reckon our audience has found some really valuable things in this. So thanks again.
Cheers, Christian. Thanks very much.
So this episode's been slightly different from our previous episodes, and we want to do more of that actually. We want to explore a broader array of topics that are all focused on helping you become a better marketer. I hope you found this episode as interesting and inspiring as I have. I'm going to leave it there for now, and I'll catch you again very soon.